Professor Barron, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at Siena College. Thank you for joining. First question I have, I guess from a historical perspective, how much weight do these debates typically carry in deciding general election results?
Yeah. For a long time, I would say presidency scholars often look at these debates and say they do matter, but in a very small amount. Like they don't generally have much of an impact. And it still will remain to be seen how much of an impact last night's debate has. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of that changed in June when you had the Trump Biden debate. For the first time in our contemporary presidency, you had an incumbent president running for reelection deliver what pretty much everybody agrees on was a pretty poor debate performance and ended up dropping out of the race. At least the debate served as a catalyst for that. And the party really came around and worked to push Biden out of the race and then quickly coalesced around Harris. So this cycle, it seems that debates have a bigger impact than perhaps they have had in the past. Now, televised presidential debates only go back to 1960. And it's always a bit of a mixed bag, but they do have at least ripple effects where you can see the candidates get themselves out before a national audience and really try to provide not just the talking points of what they'll do, policy, but really get into more of, for a lot of voters, do they look and feel presidential, right? Do you see this person as a leader? And as strange as that may sound, there's research on this. For a lot of voters, they feel comfortable when they can see the candidate and say, I see this person as president. I mean, even if you don't like who the candidate is, you get that feel for it. And so the debates do that where, part of it is this performance and how well they perform in that space can make an impact.
So you spoke before about how, obviously they kind of coalesced around Kamala Harris. And these debates help you show who the person is. So do you believe that a candidate like Kamala Harris, both Donald Trump as well, were able to use the debate to kind of showcase who they were and tell Americans who they were? Maybe Kamala Harris, especially someone who maybe hasn't traditionally been in that spotlight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. For Harris, last night was a big test. She had not been in a presidential debate before. I mean, there were the primary debates from 2020, but that's very different. She did do the vice presidential debate with Mike Pence in 2020 as well, but this is a whole different game. As the presidential nominee for her party, it was a big test to see how she performed at that level, and especially standing next to Donald Trump. And Trump is a much more known entity, obviously both being a former president, but as well as being in the public eye for, 50 years at this point. Most people know who Donald Trump is. And in a lot of ways, I think, well, let me flip it back to Harris to say that in that space, she did an excellent job in performing. I think she really she looked and sounded presidential. She was able to both provide some sense of who she is. So you saw at the very beginning, kind of talking about her background and how she grew up, but then really getting into the issues around the questions that the moderators were asking. So she was laying out both, talking about the legacy of her vice presidency in the Biden administration, but also setting it up to say, if elected, here's what I plan to do. Trump, on the other hand, as a known entity, we expected him to be pretty much Donald Trump. And he said he wasn't going to moderate his tone or change anything. He is who he is. The one surprising thing I felt was that Trump struggled a bit last night. He did make some good points. There were certainly lines of attack on some of the policy issues with Harris that he was able to do. What surprised me some was Harris's ability to put him on the defense. And I think there were a few points where he really struggled to articulate arguments in favor of himself or policy positions as it may be. And so he, in my opinion, as opposed to a few months ago when you saw him with Biden, where he was very dominant in that debate, he seemed to be more on the defensive in the debate with Harris rather than offensive. And that's kind of a first for Trump. Since 2015, when he initially jumped in the race, then he's always been very skilled at controlling the messaging and controlling press attention, and what are the talking points. And he seems to be struggling with that lately, and I think it's throwing him off because I'm not sure he has figured out yet how to make it work.
Oftentimes, the moderators are put under a lot of scrutiny. They have to ask these questions, point out the facts, and also come off as being objective.
Right.
What goes into that, and how did you see that unfold yesterday with ABC News asking Trump and Harris questions?
Sure, and that's a great question. Yeah, there's a lot that happens behind the scenes ahead of time. So as we know, so ABC News, along with the Trump and Harris campaigns, had to all come together. They agreed. Technically, they did this a few months ago with the Biden campaign, but it did change. But they largely stuck to the same format. And I feel like at the presidential level, under such scrutiny as they are, it's a difficult job for the moderators to really hold to the rules as they've laid out. And you saw that play out last night. Trump would start talking as soon as Harris stopped, and there were times where Harris would jump in as Trump was talking. And so trying to keep the candidates to the rules of, we're going to let one person talk and the mics are off, it becomes hard. I think overall, ABC did a pretty decent job. There's some minor critiques, and there were times that they let the candidates kind of run afield rather than keeping them more focused onto the talking points. But I would say that the moderators did, considering the situation and the pressure that they were under, I think they did a pretty good job with the debate overall.
There were some Republicans, I know Trump, after he was in the spin room talking to Sean Hannity, and he was suggesting that the moderators had this bias and they were asking Harris more. What goes into trying as a moderator to ask and to do, fact check both candidates, and to not only, try and do that, but also have that perception as if you're trying to ask both and be fair? And do you think that perhaps they may have asked Harris, they fact checked Trump more than they fact-checked Harris?
Sure, and that is true. However, I will say that there's a caveat to that. It's difficult to write questions and have them ask in a unbiased manner. I think again overall they did a good job. They tended to fact-check Trump more because Trump was making things up. I mean, that was the real difference. He outright lied about several things that I don't even remember what the term is that he was using, but babies aren't being killed after they're born. That is not a thing. And so the moderators did fact check him on that. I think that they did a pretty decent job overall. I also think the difficulty in moderating debates with Trump is that's how he talks. It's a rhetorical style. He's done it ever since he's been in the public. He says a lot. He uses a lot of words. He tends to maneuver through a lot of different things, but he also makes up a lot of stuff. And so it becomes harder. And one of the challenges, and we saw this in 2016, we saw it in 2020, we saw it again play out now. One of the challenges then for news outlets who are doing this, or the debate moderators, is how much of it do you want to fact check in real time? How much of it do you just want to let him talk because it's his time? You can let him speak, let the other candidate respond however the other candidate wants to respond. CNN did that in the Biden-Trump debate, right? They didn't do any real-time fact checks. They got largely criticized for doing it. I feel like it's almost a lose-lose situation for the moderators at that point, because no matter what you do, you're going to have a lot of people complaining about how they responded. I think overall CBS did a pretty decent job with it, but I will say, Trump was fact-checked more, but he needed to be fact-checked more is really what it comes down to, where Harris didn't. She did misspeak on at several points, but overall, I mean, the amount of make-believe that was coming from Trump was actually pretty excessive at times.
And this debate, different format obviously than previous debates. They did this format with Biden, but no live audience, and then the mics can be muted. How does that impact the strategies that both Kamala and Trump had going into a debate like this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. The having a live audience, it's good and bad. People who are watching the debate on TV have complained heavily about the live audiences because you're getting real-time audience reactions. At the same time, for the candidates themselves, getting the real-time audience reactions are a benefit for them, right? You're reading the room. So if, Trump says something and a bunch of people start applauding and there's some, that kind of crowd reaction, that reinforces what he's talking about. And the same would be true for Harris. She says something and people are reacting, or if there's booing. So you're getting a sense of where the crowd is, and that can feed into and play in how you're responding to the questions from the moderators, how you may respond to your debate opponent. So removing that element and then muting the mics, it does change the prep strategy for candidates so that they know they need to be on point. They're not going to have, at least realistically, a chance to try to interrupt their debate opponent, right? So they can't just. They both did last night, and you saw that, where they would say things as the other one was talking. But since it's not coming across on a live mic, you could still largely hear it, but it doesn't have the same impact. And so, it does change some of how they need to behave. So they lose the ability to get to feel like the audience is on their side, or to use that to help when it comes to their responses. It's the same thing here. They need to play it differently and think about, if they want to rebut something that their opponent is saying, how they are going to, or how they plan to do so, minus that audience and minus the ability to know that you can't just say something in the moment while they're talking, because it doesn't exist.
And when you look at a debate like this, folks can dispute the winners and losers of last night's debates. Someone could say Trump won, someone could say Kamala won. But the question really is, how much impact did this debate have on changing an opinion that someone may have had before watching the debate?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I was talking to a class this morning and said, at these presidential debates, we like to talk about winners and losers, and a lot of the punditry afterwards, whatever station you were on, you got a bunch of people there talking about, oh, I think this person won, I think this person won. There really aren't, in my opinion, you really don't have clear winners or losers, in part because for a lot of voters, if you're already siding with one of the candidates, the debates are a bit of a Rorschach test, right? You see what it is that you want to see, so you think your candidate did much better than perhaps they did. You think the other candidate definitely did worse. But the impact question, that's really, I think, what we're looking at. I feel in this moment, the potential impact is probably bigger than past debates. Certainly the June debate had a big impact on Biden, but because Harris is a less known entity, the chance for her to win over undecided voters, even probably younger or first-time voters, was much higher. And that's why, it was such a big test for her in many ways last night, to not just see how well she can perform, but, can she deliver a message that speaks to especially that group that she's going to need to start to win over? Did she speak to disaffected Republican voters? If, we know that there are some Republicans that don't like Trump and they don't want to vote for him. Several prominent folks have come out recently, the Cheneys come to mind, that said, we were not going to vote for Trump. The Cheneys endorsed Harris. There have been other prominent former Republican office holders who have said that they're not going to support Trump. Mitt Romney comes to mind, but he has not endorsed Harris, nor do I really expect him to vote for her. So the question then is, if you've got a group, and I'm not sure if I could give you a sense of how many non-Trump Republicans there are, but could she win over some of those folks to actually vote for her? Because that could make a difference, especially in some of the swing states where this race is going to be close no matter what. But if it does come down to just a few states and a few thousand votes in those states, winning over some moderates or undecideds or even some disaffected Republican voters, if Harris is able to do that, could sway the race in her favor, right? So I don't know. We'll have to wait and see till November to see how this plays out. But I think the potential for a much bigger impact from last night is definitely there.
Do you believe, that being said, the majority of Americans fall victim to confirmation bias? And if so, is there a way to try to not fall victim to that, or is that even desirable?
Wow, we could have a whole semester-long class on that one. I so what political science research tells us is that a majority of Americans, probably 2/3 to 3/4, don't pay a lot of close attention to politics. For a lot of voters, they start paying attention as we get much closer to the election. So for a lot of people, last night's debate might have been their first real, I'm starting to pay attention now. So amongst that group, do we see, sorry, remind me the full question again?
No, the question was simply, do you believe the majority of Americans fall victim to confirmation bias?
Confirmation bias. Right, okay. So we are in a very polarized climate as well. And arguably, especially presidential elections, but really elections at any level these days, it's about voter turnout, right? Most people either are firmly in one of the two-party camps. And even if you don't necessarily care for your candidate, if you're a Democrat and you're like, well, I didn't really like Biden, don't really care for Harris, but you're most likely not going to vote for Trump. You're still going to vote for Harris. And same thing is true on the Republican side, right? For a lot of Republicans, you may not really like Trump or care for him that much, but you really don't see yourself voting for the other party. And so you get this, we call it negative partisanship, where your distaste of the other party is more than even your like of the party that you're either aligned with or lean toward. A lot of independent voters in America tend to lean to one party or the other. So whether you're a partisan, so you identify, yep, I'm a member of the party, or you say, no, I'm an independent, but most independents still vote straight party line on ballots. So they're voting Democrats all the way down, or they're voting Republican all the way down. So are a lot of those folks victim to confirmation bias? Yeah, to a certain degree. I feel like we all are. How do you overcome that? That's a hard one. It's hard to set aside some of your views to be able to try to look at another candidate, their position, their policies, and evaluate them in an unbiased manner, right? Because it's easy. We're so trained, especially these days. Social media plays into this, of course, easily, right? Where it's real easy to just fall into the kind of knee-jerk reaction of, oh, this guy's terrible, I don't like him, and therefore anything that they do is negative. And so it becomes hard. It's hard to take a step back and say, let me look at the situation and try to approach it from a non-biased position to really evaluate what's going on. Most voters tend to vote, though, based on the candidates that they think are going to have a positive impact on their lives and share positions on the issues. And so that kind of bias, it's always there. I don't know that it's fully overcomable. Arguably, it would be nice if, as a society or a nation, we could have more open debates around policies and positions, because that tends, if you're focusing on an issue and what we can do about the issue. In the United States, a lot of people tend to agree on what a good goal would be to solve the issue, right? But it's how do you get to the goal that becomes problematic, and that's where we have differences. But also talking in that manner around an issue around policy can remove some of the personal biases, so you don't feel necessarily as attached as you might when you're just talking about a candidate, or you're talking broadly, well, all Republicans are like this or all Democrats are like this, because it's easy to say those things. But as we know, Obama famously said, there's not a red America and a blue America, we're really a purple America. And I mean, he was right. We all have differing opinions, and every state has a mix of voters in it. And I think when you get people talking to each other, and we can just sort of remove that initial knee jerk of, I don't like you because you support the other guy or the other party, and just talk through issues and ideas, you find that you do have a lot more in common, and that maybe you're not that far apart on a lot of things. And that, and it can help bridge some of the divides that we have.
You spoke before just now about kind of the emergence of social media, and even now you have Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. Donald Trump has been on some podcasts, Elon Musk, for example. When you have the emergence of social media in the current time like this, how does that impact debates and the importance debates have on the everyday American?
Yeah, I would, now this is not my general area of focus, but I would say it's a pretty large impact. What social media has provided. So, for example, during the debate last night, even I was sitting there scrolling through Twitter as the debate's unfolding because I'm listening to what the candidates are talking about and then watching the responses unfold. So, from press people, from other politicians, from other political scientists. And so having the spaces there can both increase the sort of confirmation bias where we're stuck in our own little bubbles watching this play out. At the same time, social media can provide space for a broadening of seeing different opinions, different perspectives, utilizing, I mean, we definitely see by this point, candidates have become far better at utilizing social media to push content out to try to influence voters. We also know foreign countries use social media to try to influence voters as well. So, social media becomes this great tool as more and more people spend time on there that can be beneficial to expand our horizons, but they can also be damaging to, put us into that bubble effect where we're just stuck hearing and seeing things that reinforce our pre-existing beliefs that may or may not be fact-based.
Donald Trump, known in the Republican primaries, he skipped out on several of the debates.
Yeah.
I believe he spoke with Tucker Carlson instead one time.
Yes.
When you have these alternatives, you can speak on these podcasts, you can speak on social media directly to individuals.
Yeah.
Does that kind of put debates under attack?
To a certain degree, sure. The modern presidency, especially of any office, is become far more candidate driven. So the individual candidates have far more resources at their disposal where they don't need necessarily a lot of the, when we go back to 50 years, go back to the 70s or even the 60s, candidates at the presidential level relied far more heavily on the parties and the party structure and the party processes for things. But in a media-driven environment, it's easier for candidates to get themselves out there. And for example, and you mentioned Trump skipping the Republican primary debates. Arguably, he was right to do so. He was the clear front runner. He was the former president. It almost was that it would have been a negative for him to go onto the debate stage. It was up to the people running to be the nominee other than Trump to make the case as to why Republicans should support them as the nominee and not Donald Trump. And so Trump didn't need to do it. And in a lot of ways, then going on Tucker Carlson's Twitter show during the debate and sort of host his own conversation. I mean, that was a very media and political savvy move because it takes attention away from his competition, people trying to knock him out of being the candidate, and recenters the focus. But in that space, he gets to largely control the conversation, right? So, Tucker Carlson's going to ask him questions, but they're friends. So he's not going to necessarily get some of either more hardball questions or have to deal with attacks from the other candidates where he can say what he wants to say. And that's the conversation, and let the other candidates, whatever audience wants to watch that.
I guess with that line of thinking, last decades, 50 years, candidates would routinely few debates in the general election.
Yeah.
Could we now see a shift from that to now candidates only participating in debates when they have politically something to gain from that debate?
Sure. Yeah, it's very possible. So this cycle is the first time that the Council on Presidential Debates did not do the debates. They're the organization that was formed by the 1960s to host the general election presidential debates. And traditionally, they'd been 2 presidential debates and 1 vice presidential debate. Sometimes it was 3 presidential debates and a vice presidential debate, but they would stagger them usually from end of August into late October. So this cycle, though, we don't have that. So the campaigns themselves set up a debate with CNN in June. They set up this ABC debate that happened in September. We know that there will be a vice presidential debate on October 1st. Beyond that, that's it. And so I do think that going forward, in part because there are other options there, candidates may choose to say, hey, I don't necessarily see a debate like this being beneficial, and may skip out altogether. And so I would not be surprised in 4 years, 8 years, who knows, sometime down the road that we just lose presidential debates altogether. I would say for the short term, there still is a norm that Americans expect to see at least one presidential debate and one vice presidential debate. So there is some public pressure on the candidates to still do these things. But like you said, if there's not a clear, like if they don't see a good political strategy where they feel like I can win this and there are benefits that come from that, then they are less inclined to participate.
And with that happening, we spoke before about the confirmation bias.
Yeah.
How important is it to have these debates where Kamala Harris is out there, is there shaking Donald Trump's hand, they're seeing each other in person,
Yeah.
and they're on one medium? How important is that, and what are the effects that could happen to a democracy if we don't have those debates anymore because of the political not taking debates?
Yeah. I think that they're very important. I think it is important for them to meet each other in person, to stand there on the same stage in the same space, facing the same moderators and answer questions, both from the moderators, talking to the moderators and the viewers, but also to each other. I think that is an important part of democracy. A healthy democracy, we should have our candidates at all levels of government engage in debates with each other. It gives the voting public a chance to see and hear from them. As I said, a lot of people don't have time or just don't really care or want to follow politics deeply. So these are moments where they do pay attention. You know what, I am going to watch the debate, or at least part of the debate. I'll tune in for a half hour, or maybe, if I like it, end up watching the whole thing. And so I think it is important that you have this play out, that the candidates are there together and engaging in these activities. And I really feel like that the impacts of them are important for our democracy. It does help give voters a sense of who they are, a sense of what they stand for, their positions on issues, what they plan to do if elected. And that's an important piece as we're heading into the election. I've taught a class where we've gone to New Hampshire before the New Hampshire primary. New Hampshire is an interesting place like Iowa because they've always traditionally gone first in the primaries. But when you talk to voters there, one of the things that they like about being the first in the nation primary is candidates spend a lot of time in their state. They do a lot of town halls. Voters get to interact with them, both one-on-one, as well as sitting in those town halls where they get to ask questions. And so I feel like the ability of individuals to feel a sense where they can vet candidates and really hear from them and be able to ask them questions is very important. Unfortunately, unless you live in a swing state, you probably don't get a lot of those opportunities. So the debates then become an alternative where at least you can still see them speak, they're answering questions. Usually a lot of the press outlets do a pretty good job of soliciting from viewers or from voters to hear, what are the big issues right now? What do people want to hear them answer questions on? And so it does at least give the general public a chance to hear from the candidates, which is important, yeah.
You spoke about that trip that you took with your students, and I guess if you can speak a little more about your takeaway, the opportunity of what it was like for your students to be able to have these interactions with the candidates, the importance of that. They're Gen Z, and particularly with the growth and emergence of social media, that less face-to-face interaction that Gen Z may have. What effects can that have for future debates or for future democracy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I would say that it's very important. For Gen Z especially, they've grown up in a time of very divisive and bitter politics. We all struggle in the United States. Our elected officials, especially at the national level, so Congress, president, tend to be older. And you have certain generational differences. For a lot of young voters and Gen Z voters, even now as we're moving into Gen Alpha, as theirs, will be coming a voting age soon, a lot of young people feel like our politics don't speak to them anymore. But if given the opportunity to where they could either interact directly with candidates running for office, ask questions, seeing things face to face, seeing things not on a social media feed or as a video, but potentially a live event like a debate, or being able to go to a town hall or a rally to participate in that way. Those kinds of face to face interactions, I think, are hugely important for a democracy. I think they help show younger generations that, hey, you do have a voice here, that there is a chance for you to be involved, that there is an opportunity for you to actually see this play out more than what you're seeing either on the news or on your social media feed. And so, yeah, I think that these things are immensely important and are all part of a healthy democracy.